Hello guys and welcome back on my channel. Today I have decided to talk about the diagnosis that I currently have, which is a schizotypical personality disorder. I've decided to talk about it because there isn't much about it out there on YouTube, because there isn't all that many people that has this diagnosis. It's a pretty rare diagnosis, and it is a diagnosis where the people diagnosing you, the professionals, they really have to be certain that you have this diagnosis before they diagnose you. So that's just what I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm going to be talking about it from some notes that I've made because I was at a team Saturday in the psychiatric place that I'm connected to, where they talked about my diagnosis. There isn't a lot of knowledge about it, so that's why they have just put it into one day where they talk about the diagnosis for people who have it and for their loved ones that are affected by them having this diagnosis, so they can better understand it. So that's the notes that I've made from that day. I'm going to be talking about my diagnosis from the notes that I've made. And I have to say, this is my notes, so this is more of the things that are true to me when it comes to this diagnosis, or that is relevant for me. So I haven't written everything down, I've just written the most important things down from this day that is relevant to me. So if you have this diagnosis, it might look very different for you, because this diagnosis is very broad and we can have very different symptoms when it comes to this diagnosis. So just because you can't see yourself in the symptoms I am describing does not mean that you do not have this diagnosis. It's very important, if you think you might have it, that you talk to professionals. Don't self-diagnose. Please don't do that. You have to talk to professionals. And in saying that, it's very important to say that sometimes professionals are wrong too. So you might have this diagnosis and they might not have found it out yet. I got another diagnosis before I got this one. I got an anxious personality disorder before I got this one. And that's because you kind of look at it as a dandelion. If you only cut the flower off, then it will keep growing back. And when you talk about things like depression and anxiety, that kind of cover up the main disease. If you only look at them, you're cutting off the flower and you're not helping the main problem, which is the main disease. And for me, the main disease is the schizotypical personality disorder, or the schizotypical disorder, which is on the schizophrenia spectrum. It kind of differs what we call it. We both call it diagnosis on the schizophrenia spectrum, and we also call it a personality disorder. And it's not either nor, so it's kind of both. So that's just important when we're talking about it. But yeah, for me, my anxiety was really heightened at the time that I had my diagnosis. So of course they thought it was an anxious personality disorder. But no, my anxiety was just so high, and it was just covering up my main disease, which is the schizotypical personality disorder. As I said before, that is not a diagnosis that a lot of people has. In the USA, it was only 4% of the population that had it. This personality disorder, of this schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And in Denmark or Norway, I think it was 1 to 2%. And these numbers are from the people who are diagnosed with this diagnosis and are in the system. So all the people who aren't diagnosed, we of course don't know how many percent of the population that is, so we can't talk about this. It's just only the people who are in connection to a place where they are getting treatment and where they've gotten the diagnosis. Starting off, borderline psychosis, so not borderline the diagnosis, but it's on the border to being a psychosis, but it isn't a psychosis. These are short, they don't last very long, and they can be stress induced. For example, you might see a slimmer of a shadow that quickly disappears. It's a micropsychosis. So what's very important to note is that this diagnosis has the same main symptoms as schizophrenia. But it isn't schizophrenia because we don't get psychosis. We get on the border
to getting a psychosis.
We do not get the psychosis. And as I talked about, there's very little knowledge about this diagnosis, and people can't agree on this diagnosis either when it comes to the knowledge about it. As I said, it's a broad diagnosis. There's a lot of symptoms that another person with the diagnosis might have that you don't have. So it's very broad. Symptoms of this diagnosis are very broad from one person to another. So it's very important to understand that. And the reasons that you get this diagnosis or this illness because of a biopsychological social model. So it can be because of genetics, so the biological part. Maybe one person in your family might have had a mental illness, and it might have been schizophrenia. They might not have had any illness. It might just be that you have inherent this vulnerability psychologically, and if you have been through some trauma, for example, in your life, this vulnerability might have turned into a diagnosis. So that's maybe why you've gotten the schizotypical diagnosis. And the social thing is, of course, the environment, for example, the environment you're growing up in. And of course, there's also the psychological facts in this. And what's very important when you're getting a diagnosis is that a lot of people can relate to what the diagnosis has of symptoms, but they can't relate a lot to it. The difference between a person with a diagnosis and a person that doesn't have a psychiatric diagnosis is that the person who has the psychiatric diagnosis is kind of hindered in their life because of this diagnosis. So the diagnosis makes it harder for them to live an everyday normal life. When you have a diagnosis, it just affects you so bad that you have to get help. It affects your normal life in such a way that you have to get help. And for normal people, it doesn't affect them as much, and therefore they do not have a diagnosis. That's simply put the difference between normal people, who probably can relate to a little bit of the symptoms, and the people who really struggle with these symptoms, and therefore have or might have a diagnosis. It's about balance and flexibility, and that's a thing the people who have this diagnosis have a hard time with. So trauma is what can kind of release your vulnerability for getting a mental illness. If you go through trauma in life, that might be what gives you a diagnosis. That's kind of what releases this vulnerability that you have and makes it into a diagnosis. And the main symptoms of this diagnosis is autism. Not in the autism spectrum kind of a way, but more in the old way that this autism term was used. This kind of autism is that something in being social is hard. Autism spectrum is developmental problems. In this case, autism is meant as someone who feels that they're different. They don't really fit in with others. They have a hard time understanding things like social cues, and this can also make it though that you isolate a lot and you generally just have a hard time being social with other people. And it's also that you really get in depth with something that you love, really get nerdy around it. Either this and you get totally consumed with the things that you really love, or you really don't have anything that interests you right now, and you have a hard time finding a balance between your interest and being social. You have a hard time making decisions.
What is a main symptom?
It's a personality trait that everyone with this diagnosis has.
Another main symptom is about your thoughts.
Other people might have a hard time understanding what you're saying because your words aren't put together in an understandable way. Either your thoughts keep racing or they stop completely. You have a long train of thoughts. You have to analyze a topic until you reach a conclusion. For example, one with this diagnosis might want to know why the sky is blue, and the person can't stop thinking about this until they reach a solution for this thought process. It's really hard on the patient when they can't find the result. It's really frustrating that you can't think this is just the way it is, that you really have to think this thought to an end. You have to find a solution and a conclusion to the things that you're thinking about, that you kind of have to get a conclusion. You have to get something over with, and until you reach this point you can't stop thinking about it. You have a hard time expressing yourself and finding the right words. And for example, it could also be that you find it hard when it comes to a birthday, because you're thinking about all the things that can happen at this birthday, and you want to have a conclusion for everything, every scenario that you think can happen at this birthday, and you want to have kind of a conclusion and a solution for everything that you think can happen at this birthday, even before you're at the birthday. For example, if you think about, am I going to sit beside somebody I don't know, and what will I do if that happens? So you think these scenarios in your head and you want to have the answers for them. And this is really hard because the birthday might be in 14 days, but you're already thinking about it right now and all the things that can happen, and you want to have a solution for all the things that can happen before you're even there. So this is really a struggle for people with this disorder. Yeah, you really have to think all of the scenarios through before you go to this birthday or before you go somewhere. The main symptoms of this diagnosis is also about how you see yourself. And you have a disruption when it comes to feelings and how you present them. For example, you might laugh or smile when someone is talking about a serious topic. You might laugh when you're at a funeral. You might also have a hard time expressing your feelings. You might also have sensory problems. Your senses might be heightened. For example, you hear everything that goes on around you. You do not have the filter that most people have that makes it so that they don't hear everything that is around them. You might easily become overstimulated, and that is something we can't cope with. You also have a disruption of who you are. For example, you might feel that you get affected by other people's feelings, and you don't really know if it's your feelings or the other person's feelings, and everything is kind of
melting together.
This is borderline psychosis. So you're on the border to getting a psychosis, but you don't actually get a psychosis. This is when everything kind of melts together and becomes unclear. You're kind of missing an identity center in yourself.
You don't know who you are and what you like, for example.
And this diagnosis typically has its debut when you are a teenager. And other symptoms that follow along might be things like, as I talked before, depression and anxiety. And if this is the only thing you see, you might not see the main diagnosis, which is causing all of the problems. And a lot of the time people with this diagnosis gets the wrong diagnosis before they arrive at this one. So because this diagnosis have so many symptoms from other diagnoses, so it's really hard to figure out if you have this diagnosis. People with this diagnosis really have a preoccupation around philosophical themes and can't really put the thoughts away, have to think them through, the thoughts that they are having. They are very much in their head. They lack sensibility of what their body needs. So for example, you might really be occupied by something you're really interested in. so you forget that you need to pee. That might be an example of it. They have a hard time feeling their feelings. And it's kind of a schizophrenia spectrum versus a personality disorder. And it's neither or, it's kind of both. And one person might be more on the schizophrenia spectrum, and for another person it might be more personality based, this diagnosis. So kind of, it depends on the person, but it's also neither or. So it's both a schizophrenia spectrum, but it's also a personality disorder. And it's very important to say that I'm talking about this from the ICD classification system, so the one that is more international. Schizotypical and schizophrenia. The main symptoms of both of these diseases are the same. Schizotypical is often in a lesser degree and more discrete degree than schizophrenia is. And the psychosis part from schizophrenia is not a part of the schizotypical diagnosis. When you have a schizotypical diagnosis, you can have borderline psychosis episodes, but again, it's only borderline, it's not a psychosis. It's kind of as if experiences that you're having when you have schizotypical personality disorder. When it comes to schizophrenia, the psychosis part is what they're struggling with the most, but with a schizotypical disorder, it's more the main symptoms that you're struggling with the most. Borderline psychosis contra psychosis. For example, everything might feel like it's a play, like it's fake. It feels as if when you have a schizotypical diagnosis, it feels like it's, for example, is fake and it's a play. But when you have schizophrenia, you think that everything is fake and you think that it is a play. But with schizotypical, you know that it isn't real. You just feel like it might be real, but you know it isn't. So it's as if people with schizophrenia kind of revolve their life around their psychosis, and we don't do that when we are schizotypical. I forgot to say that you can also have problems with memory and concentration when you have this diagnosis. So yeah, guys, this was a little bit of a longer video, but I feel that it was needed because there isn't a lot about this diagnosis on YouTube. And remember, this is just what I feel is important from this day where they talked about my diagnosis. So again, you might have other symptoms, other things that are relevant to you. I can make a new video from the last time I heard about my diagnosis, where I kind of wrote everything down, not just the things that were relevant to me. So if you want me to make an new video about that, about just in general what this diagnosis is about, and not just the things that are relevant to me, I can do that. Comment down below if you want me to do that. Again, I just hope that some people can feel less alone and less weird when I'm sharing this YouTube video about my diagnosis, because a lot of people don't have this diagnosis. A lot of people don't understand it. It's a newer diagnosis. There is not a lot of knowledge about it. So I get why people can't understand it, and I get that a lot of people might not have this diagnosis. They might have the wrong diagnosis, because a lot of people get the wrong diagnosis before they get this one. Remember the dandelion, where you just cut the top off? Maybe the anxiety and depression is what you can see. You can't see the main illness, the main diagnosis that is lying underneath. And that's why people often get the wrong diagnosis when it comes to this diagnosis. I also heard about a girl who was at this day where I heard about the diagnosis. She got autism spectrum disorder diagnosis before she got this one, because there's some autistic traits in it, but just not in the typical way to think of autism. Is not the autism spectrum way, it's the old-fashioned way of thinking of autism. Guys, I really hope that you could use this video for something, and if you like this video, please remember to subscribe, like this video, and start a conversation down below. Just remember to do it in a friendly tone. We're all human. No one wants to get attacked. No one wants to be bullied. We're all human. Just please remember that in the comment section. There should be space for every one of us on YouTube and just in life in general. And yeah, guys, that was it for today. I'll see you soon. Bye, guys.